Hey everyone, welcome back to Adherent Apologetics. As always, we're brought to you by you with your support on patreon.com/Adherent Apologetics. Today I'm joined by Dr. Braxton Hunter. You may know who he is if you know apologetics. He hosts Trinity Radio, the president of Trinity Seminary. Braxton, welcome. How are you doing?
Doing great. Thanks for having me on the channel, man. This has been a long time coming, and I'm honored to be here.
Yeah, I'm really pumped to have you on. You have one of the fastest growing YouTube apologetics channels, just hit 10,000 subscribers. So congrats. So just for people who may not know who you are, can you talk about like who you are, what you do, like what's going on with Trinity Radio and everything?
Yeah. So for YouTube purposes, as you said, I'm the president of Trinity College of the Bible and Theological Seminary. And if you're just a layperson, or if you do want to go into ministry of some sort, then we offer courses and stuff like that. And you can do it right from home. If you have the technology to watch this video right now, you have everything you need. And you can visit us at trinitysem.edu, trinitysem.edu. And I hope you will. But putting that aside, for YouTube purposes, our channel is kind of a response channel. It's primarily geared toward atheists, although we've talked about all the different major world religions and cults of Christianity and things like that. But primarily it's geared toward atheists and the atheist YouTube crowd. And so we do response videos to videos that atheists will put out. YouTube is just dominated with atheism. And so we felt like we needed there to be good responses that people can understand and that they can take and use to the sorts of things that they'll hear from atheists on YouTube. And God's really blessed that. We've seen a lot of people come to Christ through that ministry, and we get messages like that every day. And so just this morning, I had one of our patrons messaged me and said that her son is an atheist, and she was sending him the video that I posted this morning. So, God uses this sort of thing, and this is a way that we can impact the world, and we should be grateful we live in a time where these sorts of resources are possible.
Yeah, it's so much great stuff happening over at Trinity Radio. I want to welcome everyone who's joining us, Roxby, Susan, the programmer, everyone else. But I'm curious, like, a lot of universities don't have like a YouTube, like apologetics channel. Like I know I go to like Liberty, a Christian university. We don't have anything like that. So like what interested you guys in starting like Trinity Radio?
Well, actually, Trinity Radio started before I had any official position at the seminary. I was in full-time evangelism and apologetics work, but I was serving kind of as a recruiter for Trinity Seminary, kind of an unofficial sort of position. And I started Trinity Radio because people knew of me, because they knew that I was doing some work to push people to the school. So I started a podcast just in my attic, just by myself back in like 2009. And over the years, it just developed. And when I became a professor here, I continued it. And Jonathan Pritchett, my co-host, he's our vice president of academic affairs. He jumped on back in 2015, 2014, something like that. And then when we decided to move it to YouTube, that's when things really started to pop. So it's actually not technically directly affiliated with our school. But so I guess that's kind of answers your question. That's kind of how it happened. I'm into apologetics. And so I have a channel that's related to apologetics. And since I work at a school called Trinity, we just tied it all up together in a bow.
Looks pretty nice if I say so myself. So today we're going to be talking about the argument from free will. We're going to be talking about like why I think we have free will, how it connects to God, talking about objections, all sorts of stuff. So I'm curious, like what got you interested in like the argument from free will, and like what is it, in case someone doesn't know who it is, though it sounds pretty simple, you would think.
Yeah. So for several years, I was more interested. So I've been into apologetics since the early 2000s, but somewhere toward the end of the thousands, the end of before we got into 2011, 2012, I guess until probably about 2013, I had gotten into internal theological discussions with Calvinists. And Calvinists are Christians who they would say they believe in free will, but they believe in a different understanding of free will. They believe in what's called compatibilism. And maybe we'll get into what those definitions mean in just a few minutes. But and so they ultimately believe in determinism, that whatever you end up doing, it could not have been otherwise. And that the choices you make are in at least some sense determined by things outside of you. Perhaps God determines those things through secondary causes. Well, atheist naturalists believe in determinism, although they don't believe that God is determining things. They believe that just the cold hard universe is determining things. The past history of the universe is like a chain of dominoes that led to ultimately your parents and then your birth and the formation of your neural structure and the firings of neurons, such that what we call your choices, and they are your choices, but they could not have been otherwise. So while you feel like you're free to choose other than whatever you end up choosing, in the most basic sense, you're not. And that couldn't have been otherwise. And so I was arguing with Calvinist Christians who are determinists for several years. And I have 4 debates on that subject, 2 live public on stage debates with Calvinists that are on this channel, or on my channel, and on our website at trinityradio.org. And but I got really convicted at some point. Braxton, you want to be an evangelist. You want to be someone who reaches people for Christ. And as interesting and important as these doctrinal issues are, I wanted to see people who didn't know Christ come to know him for the first time. But I had put all this study into this Calvinism stuff, like years of study. So I said, Lord, in fact, in this room that I'm in right now, I was right on the floor. I can see where I was, and I was praying. And I said, Lord, if there's a way that the stuff that I've learned for the Calvinism discussions could be helpful with atheists, with reaching atheists, would you just please make that clear to me? And I can't convince anyone of this. This is my own personal experience, but almost in that moment, it occurred to me that William Lane Craig's moral argument, and William Lane Craig's moral argument is if God does not exist, then objective moral values and duties do not exist. Premise 2, objective moral values and duties do exist, therefore God exists. And so it occurred to me that, hey, that would work really well with free will, especially if someone already believes in free will. They don't have to already believe in it for the argument to work, but it sure is helpful if they already do. And a lot of people do. And so I thought you could say, and so here's the argument. If God does not exist, then libertarian freedom does not exist. And that's a particular kind of freedom. It's the type of freedom that most people think they have, probably without ever thinking too much about it. That whatever I ended up doing, I could have done something else. When I raised my hand up like this, I could have just as easily raised the other hand, those kind of things. And at the very least, that nothing external to you determined what you would end up doing. Most people sense that they have that sort of free. I think, now I've got friends like Chris Tate and Tyler Vela who don't agree with me on that, but I think most people sense that they have something like that. And so premise 1, if God does not exist, then libertarian freedom does not exist. Premise 2, libertarian freedom does exist, and therefore 3, God exists. And so what you do then is you defend those premises and get to that conclusion. And I used this debate most notably in my debate with Matt Dillahunty last year, but I also used a lot of the same reasoning when I debated Dan Barker of the Freedom from Religion Foundation just a couple of months ago. So that's the argument. And of course, there's a lot of details and specifics you can get into with it.
Yeah, I think it's a really fun argument to kind of look at. I remember listening to the Dillahunty debate, and it's like, if you listen to like Craig's debates or most debates, it's like a cosmological argument and a moral argument, but a free will argument really complements them if you believe in it. It's something different and something interesting. So I think it'd be helpful just to define our terms for a second. You believe in like libertarian freedom. So like, what is libertarian freedom? How does it differ between like compatibilism or determinism, like the two other really players in this debate?
Yeah. So the way I do it is I say like this. So you've got when people are talking about philosophers, theologians, when people are talking about free will, there are basically only 2 options. There is libertarian freedom, which people define differently, but I say it like this. Libertarian freedom may include the ability to have done other than whatever you ended up doing, right? When I look at an action I just took, I really could have done otherwise. Like I can't do anything about it now that I did it. But in the moment, I could have done something other than whatever I ended up doing. But at the very least, what it must include is that nothing external to the agent, external to me, determined what I would do, such that it had to be that way. So that's important to note for libertarian freedom. And as I say, I think this is the type of freedom that most people just assume they have. Most of the time. On the other hand, you've got determinism, and determinism is the idea that that free will, in that sense, the libertarian sense, doesn't exist. It's not a thing. Either it's not even possible, or at the very least, we don't have it. So determinism, as I said before, is like the past history of the universe is like a chain of dominoes, leading to everything that ends up happening. It's like one domino leading to another thing right on down the line, especially when we're talking about naturalistic determinism that atheists hold to. So that you couldn't control that you were born, or the family that you were born into, or the influences that would come on you. And so as a result of that, all of this that happens in your life, from your biology and genetics to the things that you experience, lead to unchangeably what we call the choices that you will make. But even though you feel like you could have done otherwise, even though you feel like when you did this, you could have just as easily have done this, you really couldn't. It was determined, and it was going to be that way since the beginning of the universe. And so that's determinism. Now, you mentioned compatibilism, and there are Christians and there are atheists who are compatibilists. In fact, I have it right here in front of me. 59.1% of philosophers and graduate students working in philosophy today take the position of compatibilism. Well, then why could I say that there's only two options, libertarian freedom or determinism? Well, because compatibilism is determinism. It's a way of thinking about determinism that says, look, whatever, this is the way to think about it. So you, Zach, you are free. The compatibilists would say you're free in the sense that you can do whatever you want to do. You can do whatever you want. And what more do you want than the freedom to do whatever you want? But the wants that you have are out of your control. And those are the things that drive your actions. And so as a result, it's still determinism, because whatever you want that you couldn't control drives whatever you do. So it's still an unbroken causal deterministic chain. But even though that's true, since you're doing what you want to do, we can call that free will. Now, the people that know what they're talking about with this will still say, no, that's determinism. That's still determinism. And if you'll talk to like a Christian Calvinists like Guillaume Bignon, who wrote probably the most popular book on how we're still able to be morally responsible for our actions, even if we have that, he will say, yeah, compatibilism is determinism. If you talk to someone like Daniel Dennett, who's an atheist, compatibilism is still determinism. So that I'm not trying to be tricky with that. That is the way it is, but that's the spread. So you've got libertarian freedom and determinism. And then some people that hold to determinism talk about it in the terms of compatibilism because it allows for the use of the language of freedom. And they would say it is a form of freedom.
Mm-hmm. Well, thank you. So we're going to talk about like three arguments that you have for free will. I know in that survey that you mentioned, I think it's only about like 18% of philosophers who believed in libertarian freedom, if I remember right. I could be wrong there. So you might be in a little bit of a minority position here. So I'm curious, like with these three arguments, maybe just start with one and we can talk about it, like why I think we have libertarian freedom.
Yeah, so it sounds like you're familiar with this study that was done. Everybody points to this study because it was a pretty wide study. It was done by David Chalmers and David Burgett, and what they found was, before I answer your question directly, is that, like I said, views on free will among philosophers and graduate students, 3,000 professors. They found that 59.1% affirmed compatibilism, 13.7% affirmed libertarian freedom. Now, that is the minority, but that's still a substantial number of philosophers and graduate students. And then no free will, 12.2%, and then other 14.9%, which probably means they weren't very clear. In other words, 1 in 7 of them believe in libertarian freedom. But here's the important thing to keep in mind. You're right, it is a minority position in this study, but this study, 72.8% of those studied were atheists, and 49.8% of those studied were atheist naturalists. So basically what you're finding out there is, if you study mostly atheist professors and philosophy students, guess what you're going to find? You're going to find that most of them don't believe in libertarian freedom, although some of them do. But then if you study, if you look at like Scientific America did a study, and they came up with 59% of their readers believed in libertarian freedom. So that would be, that would kind of tell you that, okay, so the average population seems more inclined toward libertarian freedom. But if you get a bunch of atheist philosophers together, of course, they're not going to overwhelmingly believe in libertarian freedom. So really, there's no surprise there, I think. And it actually backs up premise one of my argument, which is that if you take God out of the equation, if God does not exist, libertarian freedom is less likely or does not exist. So, okay, by that point now, I think I forgot your question. Were you asking me the arguments for free will?
Yeah, I mean, you talked about it. You have like 3 arguments. I figured we could kind of walk through these one by one. So
Yeah.
wherever you want to start with, like arguments for free will.
Yeah. So what you do there is you say, okay, so premise 2 of the argument is where a lot of the action happens. In fact, to this day, I've never really had many people challenge premise 1, that if God does not exist, libertarian freedom does not exist. But premise 2, libertarian freedom does exist. And I want to say again that the person for whom this argument is going to be most compelling are going to be people who are not like your YouTube atheist person or an atheist philosopher, but are going to be everyday people that you know who already believe in libertarian freedom. So you can just show them how it gets you to God. But for those that would challenge premise 2, what the first thing is the least satisfying to most people, even though I think it's powerful. So I'll start with the least compelling reason. So the first argument that I would raise is, okay, if libertarian freedom does not exist, then rational affirmations are impossible. Rational, and then premise 2, rational affirmations are possible. Therefore, libertarian freedom exists. Now, what we mean by this, and those of you in your audience who've listened to Tim Stratton talk before have maybe heard this sort of thinking about this. But what we want to say here is, all right, look, rationality, the reason that we are justified in claiming knowledge of certain things, like that I'm on a stream with you right now. The reason we can claim to know certain things is because there is a process of rationality that's gone on when we're doing decision making and deciding what we will believe. Rationality is a process by which we look at the available data for a particular thing and choose whether or not we should affirm this or we should affirm that. So that's a process, and it involves free will. You have to be able to choose against the wrong thing. You have to be able to assess the options and freely choose against the wrong thing to choose the right thing, so that you're justified in claiming that you know something, that you know a particular thing. But for instance, if a person comes to believe that he is a brilliant atheist scientist, and then person B comes to believe that he's a pink unicorn, well, if free will does not exist, well, then they both got to those conclusions via a deterministic method that was completely outside of their control. So why does the guy who thinks he's the brilliant atheist scientist have any reason to conclude that he's correct? I mean, he's just believing whatever he was determined to believe. He just finds himself believing these things in a certain sense. So here's I know I'm kind of running off at the mouth, but I'll give you this analogy that Tim gives that I think is really great. It really helps people to understand exactly what we're saying. So let's imagine that you and I are looking at a third person, and we happen to know about that third person that everything that they are doing, saying, and thinking is being controlled by a mad scientist. And we don't know the intentions of that mad scientist. That mad scientist may want the person to believe wrong things. We don't know. May want them to believe right things, but the person isn't reasoning to those things, even though the person feels like they are. The mad scientist is deciding what they're going to believe, what they're going to think, and the next words that are going to come out of their mouth. Now, do we have any reason to believe this person is rationally justified in anything that they conclude? Well, of course not, because they don't know the motivations of that mad scientist. How do they know that whatever they end up believing is anywhere close to correct, when everything that they're believing has been put in their head by the mad scientist? Mm-hmm. Well, it's actually worse than that for the atheist who believes in determinism, because whatever they end up believing, even though they feel like they went through a process of reason, if they weren't free to choose against bad things and choose the right things, the true things, or the things most likely to be true, then it's just the blind forces of nature that brought them to that point. So it's even worse than a mad scientist. So for that reason, you can't have, and I don't think there's any good way to escape this argument, you cannot have rational justification for anything. You can't know that you're right. You can't, and therefore you can't have knowledge claims. And so what a person would then need to do is the atheist determinist would need to go home and sit around and think for a while and figure out how he can have justified knowledge claims, because then at least he would know something. So that's one argument that I think is powerful. And I think we all know that we're able to make justified knowledge claims. And so I think that's powerful. But even if you didn't think even if you're like, well, okay, but maybe we just aren't able to make justified knowledge claims. Well, then at that point, go home, because it's over. There's no point in arguing about it, because nothing we're saying are things we know.
I think one like kind of objection that can be raised to this argument you bring up is maybe like a pragmatist approach to this. Like you say, hey, maybe our choices aren't free, that maybe they're determined, but it seems like they work, like obviously man has enough knowledge to understand astrophysics and get to the moon. So even if our choices are determined, and it may be irrational in a sense, they still work. They'd apply to reality. So it wouldn't be like this, like throw everything up and burn all the papers in the fire and go crazy, because even if it's determined, things are still working just fine. So how would you respond to like that kind of response to this argument?
Well, what I'd say to that sort of thing is, okay, you think that it's working, but the only reason you believe that you built a rocket that took you to the moon is because you were determined to believe that. Remember, there are people out there who are, it's just like some people will object to this argument by saying, well, the thing about it is I can get with other people, and those other people can confer with me, and I can check sort of what I've concluded off of what they came to as well. But of course, the only reason but they're trusting, first of all, your belief that they're confirming what you're saying is something you were determined to believe. And there are people in mental facilities right now who think all kinds of other people are confirming their beliefs, that they're a pink unicorn or whatever. And so, so that's that. But then also, even the people confirming your belief, they too are only coming to the conclusions they are because they were determined to get there. Now, a related issue that might help with that, the understanding of that answer, is to say something like this. So, in my debate with Matt Dillahunty, he challenged me by saying, look, you could take something like a calculator, which is a completely deterministic device that gives you deterministic outputs. It's not reasoning. None of us think that it's going through a process of reason. And it pretty well always gives you the right answer. Well, okay, first of all, it's giving you the right answer because it was designed by an intelligence that was rational and was using reason. So now you've just made it worse for yourself, because now you've not only got the free will argument, but a teleological argument piled on top of that. So good job with that. But secondly, the calculator can be right even though it's deterministic. And if you're right, this is the pragmatism thing, it could be the case that you could get to right conclusions. That's true. The problem is you could never know that you got to right conclusions. You could never have justified knowledge claims. And let's just say we gave you everything you want and said, fine, it works pragmatically. That's good enough for you. So go about your life. Okay. But now we're not talking about philosophy anymore. We're not talking about the nature of God's existence or free will or anything. You're just kind of saying, I don't care. I'm going to do the best with what I've got. So there's some thoughts there.
Yeah, a lot of great stuff there. So let's go to the second argument. I do want to say we will answer any questions or super chats at the end. But what's the second argument that you have for establishing that we would have some sort of libertarian freedom?
Yeah. So as I thought more, as I told you, I came to this argument thinking about William Lane Craig's moral argument. And the second premise of Craig's moral argument is that objective moral values and duties do exist. Well, as you know, a lot of people on the internet, on YouTube, don't believe in objective moral values, and they'll tell you that. People like Skylar Fiction that will just tell you that they don't believe in objective moral values in the sense that we mean it anyway. So how does he defend that? Well, the way he defends that is to say, all right, look, a good argument is an argument that has premises that are plausible. These premises are more likely to be true than false. That's what you want in a good argument. Graham Oppy talks a lot about arguments and what's the use of arguments and what are we trying to do with arguments. And he does that in his book, Arguing About Gods. But then the other day when he debated Andrew Loki, I don't know if you saw that, but in that debate, he said, before we begin talking about this, what's the point? Because if I'm not convinced by your premises, then what does it even matter? So yeah, there's something valuable there. Someone can disagree with the premise and just be wrong, or they can disagree with the premise and be right. But what we want in premises of an argument is that they would be more likely to be true than false. Well, here's the thing. I would say about morality, and I would say about libertarian freedom, that the impulse that we have that it's true, the intuition that we have that it's true, is so powerful, is so evident and so strong to us that it is stronger than any premise of any argument brought to defeat it. In other words, our intuition of it makes it more plausibly true than the premises of an argument that would be to show that it's false. And this is somewhat related to Richard Swinburne's principle of incredulity that he uses with his argument from religious experience, which is to say something like this. This is my paraphrase of it, is to say something like, if I have an intuition or an impulse inside of me, let's just say an intuition, that it seems almost impossible to doubt. Almost, I won't say it's impossible to doubt, because I'm not saying I have like absolute certainty, but if it seems almost impossible to doubt, then I am rationally justified in maintaining that belief until such a time as someone gives me a strong enough argument that I'm compelled to reject that intuition. And to date, I don't think any argument has premises that are plausible enough to overcome the plausibility that's brought forth from my own intuition about morality and libertarian freedom. So that would be like a second reason to believe.
Yeah, it's great stuff there. I think that one of the more common objections you see to this is like, well, sometimes our intuitions could be wrong. You could say like, 600 years ago, most people thought the earth was flat. And when Columbus was sailing to America, he was just going to sail off the edge of the earth and it was kind of be done. So maybe our intuitions may be helpful. They're not always trustworthy. And they maybe argue that with free will as we find neuroscience and such, eventually we're going to understand how this actually works. Even, our intuitions can be deceitful.
Yeah. So the first answer is the easiest one, which is to say, right, our intuitions can be wrong. That's why I say, I'm not saying it's impossible to make me doubt libertarian freedom or morality. I'm saying that it seems almost impossible to doubt. So I'm ready to doubt if someone gives me a good enough argument, because that's what arguments are doing anyway. They're meant to convince and to that reasonable people would change their mind. But at the same time, I don't think that with that example of sailing off the edge of the world, that's necessarily an intuition of the same order. People don't necessarily, they don't have this innate intuition that the world is flat. That comes through observation. They look around and they see that it looks to me like it's flat. I do a few simple measurements and it seems to be flat. I go up on top of the mountain and it still seems to be kind of flat. I sail and it looks like there's a horizon that kind of looks like an edge that looks like it's flat. And they come to that conclusion. But I don't think that from a very young age, if they weren't told one thing or the other, that they would just have this intuition about it. They observe and draw conclusions. Still, the point is still made that we do kind of have intuitions about things. I'm trying to think of a good example of this, but I'm sure we have intuitions that turn out to be false. But I'm happy to admit that I could be wrong. But someone would need to bring a strong enough argument to compel me that I'm wrong.
Fair enough. So what's this third and final argument that you have for establishing that we would have libertarian freedom?
So the third one is related to morality. And in fact, this is why I think that it's possible that this free will argument could actually do everything that William Lane Craig wants his moral argument to do and more, because you've got all these other things that you get from free will, but you also get the morality thing. Because if there is no libertarian freedom, then we're left with what I would refer to as moot morality. So let's just forget the fact that Christians and atheists always argue about whether and how morality can be objective or not, like whether it's subjective or objective. Let's just say that atheism can have objective morality. Let's just say they can. I don't think they can, but let's just say that they can. Okay, well, even so, if determinism is true, whatever I end up doing, whether it's objectively good or objectively evil, I couldn't help it. Like literally, I couldn't help it. I was determined to do it, and it could not have been otherwise. And so you're left with moot morality. Morality becomes meaningless. Now, you can still punish people in the sense that you can lock them up so they don't kill, like if they killed someone, so they don't kill anybody else. You could do that. Sure, that's fine. But what you can't do is hold them morally culpable, morally responsible, like that they, you have no justification for blaming them for whatever they end up doing. And in fact, it's very interesting because if you listen to, there's a backyard discussion that took place between cosmic skeptics Alex O'Connor and Rationality Rules Stephen Woodford, in which they're talking about this. And Alex says, but if what we're saying is true, doesn't that mean that if a man kills his family, that he's not really to be blamed for that in that sense? And there's no sense in being emotionally upset toward him. And I may be getting I may be saying that not exactly the way they said it, but it's the point. And he said, yeah, That's that's how we should look at it. And there are people who are actually trying to work on how we should have a more sensible justice system that takes into account that the universe made me do it, and I couldn't have changed it myself. But try that in court. The universe made me do it, and see if you get away with murder. It's not going to work. And the reason it's not going to work is because our justice system somewhat presupposes libertarian freedom. And I think that's because we in some sense just recognize it as a feature of reality that we have this libertarian freedom. So I think those are some things that have to do with it. The morality thing just kind of goes down the toilet if that's the case, such that, and at this point in American history, at least, it's powerful to say this. And I did say it on Unbelievable Christian Radio, and I'll say it again here. And I know that it sounds offensive, but I'm using something at the fringes of our emotions and logic because I want it to penetrate our thinking. What was done to George Floyd was a horrible thing. I can say it was a morally reprehensible thing, and that the people who did it should be blamed. But here's the thing about that. If you're a determinist, what you are forced to say is that those actions were determined, and though we may hold the people responsible, they're not morally culpable, and they could not have done otherwise. In other words, what happens when a racial hater does something like that, or someone is abusive toward women, or someone shoots up a gay nightclub, or whatever thing that happens, you have to, in some sense, look at the perpetrator. If determinism is true, which I don't hold to, you have to look at it and say they couldn't help it. And if you're willing to say that, I've got some beachfront property in Tennessee I'd like to sell you.
Beachfront property in Tennessee sounds pretty nice, especially right now being in Pennsylvania where we just got like 2 feet of snow. So
oh man, wow.
Yeah. So I think that it's very interesting. I remember you talking about this on Unbelievable, and it's a very compelling argument. But I think some people could look at this and say it's just arguing from consequences. Like, we don't like the consequences of kind of having to say, well, yeah, this person who maybe like shot up a school, they had to do that. They couldn't have not done it. But to just say then that we need to put free will into this is just kind of like arguing from consequences. So what do you think of that kind of like objection to this line of argument?
So it would be an argument from consequences, and it would be fallacious if I was just saying that would be terrible, wouldn't it? So it can't be true because that would just be so terrible. But what I'm actually saying is you understand already that that's not the way it is. Intuitively, you know that's not right. And when we look at the way that humanity functions, we have a whole anthropology that points in the direction that we all kind of recognize that's not the way it is. So I'm kind of pointing back to your intuitions about that again. But here's the thing. If someone has a problem with intuitions, the truth about it is that's what we have immediate access to. Anything you have to observe and draw conclusions from your observations is secondary in a certain sense, epistemologically speaking, but you have direct first-person access to your intuitions. And when we're talking about morality, I think Michael Jones just said this on our live stream last week, is that when we're talking about morality, we're talking about something that is a feature of human thinking. It relates to human thinking. The only way to study it, the only way to draw conclusions about morality really is to look within ourselves and look at culture at large and say, what seems to be the state of affairs? And I'm saying when you do that, you find, wait a minute, the justice system seems to presuppose libertarian freedom. Mm-hmm. Most justice systems, if not all, do that. I certainly seem to have a strong intuition such that you even have people like Dan Barker writing a book in which he's defending whether he wants to call it acompatibilism or compatibilism. It's compatibilistic determinism. And he says about it, we still have the illusion of free will. So even he admits there's an illusion of free will. He just has to do that because of his worldview. So when all of human experience kind of seems to foster this belief, and the only place we have to go to understand these moral truths is within our anthropology and within humanity. And it looks like the evidence there points to libertarian freedom, and that morality is an objective thing, and that it really is wrong to X, Y, and Z. I think that all of that kind of backs up the point.
Definitely. So we talked about like 3 different arguments to establish you have libertarian freedom, but I think it'd be useful to kind of tie this into God. Like, why think that we need to have, if we have libertarian freedom, why think that it would kind of point to God, or in your syllogism, we can only have libertarian freedom if God exists?
Yeah. So if God does not exist, then the universe is a closed system of causal relations. And even if it's not, and even if there is a multiverse that stands outside of and sans our physical universe, at some point it's a closed system of cause and effect. And so as a result, all you're going to get are these causal relations. And so you need something else. Now, the way I used to argue this is, so you need something like a supernatural aspect to this. You need something that allows for us to break that system of physical causal relations and have something like agent causation that is not only hierarchical, which is something that comes up in the literature, but like hierarchical thinking is, the first layer of thinking is you're going to say, well, I want some chocolate cake. But then the second layer is, I want the chocolate cake, but I want next year to be thinner than I am right now. And so you're able to do hierarchical thinking. That alone doesn't solve the problem. But you need to have that, I think, for sure. And that happens with intelligent people, rational agents like human beings. But then on top of that, I think you need something else, a spark of something spiritual. That's why you get people like Tim Stratton and Eric Hernandez arguing for the soul, because they think soul is the way to do this. I actually think there's another way now. I spent the first half of this year studying quantum mechanics and trying to figure out, is there a naturalistic way we could have libertarian freedom? I was trying to challenge premise one of my own argument. And I came to believe that maybe there is. And I talked about this on Unbelievable very briefly. And I think that Robert Kane is a good example of someone who has provided a possible way. And Roger Penrose also has done work on something not directly related to free will, but related to it. I know I'm kind of being unclear, but hopefully this will clear it up. Mm-hmm. So in quantum mechanics, you have this strange thing that happens that we know happens now, and it's super weird. In fact, I've recently been saying, whenever some atheist points at a Christian and says, oh, how can I believe this? You got talking snakes and talking donkeys. I say, listen, you live in a world where quantum mechanics is happening. Don't talk to me about things that seem impossible. Mm-hmm. And so with quantum mechanics, you have this waveform that upon measurement, when there's a measurement device placed there, it collapses into a specific location. And it seems somewhat indeterminate or random. And so but let's just go with indeterminate. It doesn't seem to be understood on Newtonian physics that would be more at home with determinism. It seems like something indeterminate is happening. And this is understood to be a realistic understanding among physicists today. Okay, so the question then becomes, if that's happening, does that somehow play into this? And what you have with Robert Kane is the suggestion, and we're not saying that we're dogmatic about this. What we're saying here is, if this is even possibly true, then it serves as a defeater to the claim that you couldn't have libertarian freedom on naturalism. So what we're going to say is, okay, if there is this thing that happens at the quantum level that's indeterminate, doesn't follow classical Newtonian determinism like that, mm-hmm. then what if it is the case that that's going on in our brains? And then you go over to Roger Penrose, and Roger Penrose has this whole thing about microtubules and that our brains might be quantum computers. And this is a very popular topic of discussion among philosophers and physicists today. So mm-hmm. the thing that we have to, so the possibility is, okay, what if there is in our choices, in our decision-making, this element of indeterminism, this element of that breaks the determinism and allows for a free choice there. And so I came to believe, and there's more to say about this, but I think you may bring an objection. I'm going to see if you do. That will allow me to say more about it in a moment when we talk about randomness and indeterminacy. Mm-hmm. But if there's an element of indeterminacy in our thinking, in our decision making, then this could be the means by which we are able to make free will choices. And there's work being done on this by a number of different people, some of whom are not Christians or theists. And so that's an interesting thing. Now, here's the thing, though. My premise one, if God does not exist, then libertarian freedom exists. If God does not exist, then libertarian freedom does not exist. I think still holds, because what I just described is so incredibly unlikely to happen on its own that it would be like the greatest example of a design argument for God's existence on its own of any design argument we've ever thought of before. And so I would say it would still require God to be that specific. So obviously I don't expect people to be that clear to people. I could point them to a couple of things in the literature. One thing that I would point people to is go look up anywhere you can find where Roger Penrose has written about microtubules. You can also look at the chapter that Robert Kane has in the Oxford Handbook on Free Will, which is a great resource. And he goes through everything that I've just said. Also, for those that don't want to pay the $60-something or whatever it is for the book, there's actually a YouTube video of Robert Kane, and it's like the only one he's in on YouTube, where he's giving basically that entire chapter and just verbatim. So you could go look that up, maybe get a little more detail. But I'm also happy to go further into it now because it's super interesting to me.
Yeah, there's so much there. And we'll get to some of the randomness objection here in a second. The world of quantum mechanics is just really weird. I was reading the Quantum Enigma over the school semester, and I'm like, the first time I ever really read about quantum mechanics, I'm like, this is crazy. Like, I was talking with one of my really good friends is studying physics at Wisconsin, and I was like, what do you think of all this? And he's like, it's just crazy. No one really knows what's happening with all this. So it's a lot of fun. So we're gonna go
the Quantum Enigma is the first book I read on this issue. And I encourage people, it's an Oxford published book, and it's fantastic and it's mind blowing. And you will come away with it thinking, okay, the world is it's like, let me say this real quick. When I love the Narnia books, the Chronicles of Narnia, I read them with my kids when they were younger. And the Voyage of the Dawn Treader, which there was a movie made about it, but this scene is not in the movie, where they're talking about how in their world, which is our world, Earth, the human children are talking about in our world, the world is round. And Caspian, I think it is talking about how, well, no, here in Narnia, it's a flat world. You mean you live in a world that is round? You can walk all the way around and go to the bottom of it. And what are you, upside down then? That's so whimsical and like a cartoon, And so when I think about certain features of the real world, like that we are on a spherical Earth, and like that my little dog Indy is this cute little fuzzy creature that is like a Narnia man. He has personality. And when I think about near-death experiences and stuff we get, and quantum mechanics, when people think the supernatural sounds ridiculous just on the face of it, I think, do you realize you live in a Narnia world right now? Do you get that?
Yeah. This world there's so much left to be discovered. We'll go through some questions, some objections, some super chats. We'll kind of mix it all in right now. First, we have a super chat from the London Theist Dean. Thank you so much for your super chat. Really appreciate it. He says, two of my favorite Christian apologists together, having a brilliant chat. Keep up the great work, guys. God bless. Thank you, Dean.
Thanks.
And I just wanted to remind you that Tottenham lost to Liverpool yesterday, 2-1. So do you know English football at all, Braxton?
I know no football. I don't pay attention to any sports ball games.
You probably don't even know I'm talking about soccer right now, actually. So.
I think, well, I know that much. I know that they have soccer, and I know in Australia, if there's any Australia listeners, they have a version of football that's like American football, but follows different rules. And even most people in Australia don't know the rules. I know that much.
I feel like that's all you really need to know. Yeah. This was an objection I had kind of written up that is a perfect time to talk about it. From writer John Buck says, "Hi, Braxy Poo. How would you respond to the randomness objection? Either an act is due to reasons or for no reason, neither be due to an agent." I looked it up a different way, someone phrasing the randomness objection, and they just said, chance exists. If our actions are caused by chance, we lack control. We cannot call that free will because we cannot be held morally responsible for random actions. So there's different ways of phrasing the randomness objection, but how do you respond to it in terms of this dialogue on free will?
Yeah, so I would actually say that what we do for reasons, and we do these things because of influences. The question is, do those reasons or those influences serve as causes that make us do the particular thing that we do? And so this is where I say, okay, now there's two ways to look at this. Obviously, I want people to look deeper into this issue with quantum mechanics, but let me make it, if you don't buy that, let me give you something that I think is just as good, that works just as well. So the idea with quantum mechanics thing is that there's indeterminacy. So that say, and this is Robert Kane's example. So think about this, and this deals with this objection. So imagine that that a woman is walking down a road to a business meeting, and she has to get there because she's going to get the promotion she's wanted her whole life. All her dreams are going to come true. She wants to get that promotion, but she has to be there on time. And she's going to be late if she doesn't hurry. And as she passes an alleyway, she sees that there's a mugging happening in there. Now, she has two competing desires here. The desire to do something about the mugging, like call 911 and wait and watch what happens or something, try to stop it herself. Maybe she's been taking some Taibo classes. I don't know. Or she can go on and fulfill the other desire to go to the business meeting. All right. Now, what Robert Kane posits is that possibly that in moments like this, there is this chaos in our thinking. So that like when we're walking into a gas station and there's two doorways there, it may be somewhat deterministic which door we go through. We're not thinking that much about it. But in a moment like this with the woman, she has this, what do I really want to do? And this is the same sort of thinking that might come up when you have a decision about where do I want to eat dinner, or who am I going to marry, or where am I going to go to school? You have this real chaos in your brain where you don't even know for sure what you're going to do, and you're thinking hard about it. And in such a moment, these things that are felt at the quantum level are experienced at the macro level of our decision making, and this indeterminate thing, which we would call random, isn't the choice, but it's an ingredient, and that's the key. It's an ingredient in the decision making process, so that you have all these reasons and influences, and perhaps these reasons and influences would weigh on your desires like determinists think and cause you to do one thing or the other, except for this element of indeterminacy that's there that allows for as an ingredient, not as the whole ball of wax, but as an ingredient there, allows you to choose one or the other. And if you don't like that being explained naturalistically with quantum mechanics, we'll just do it the same way that someone like Eric Hernandez and Tim Stratton would do it and say, if God exists, God could bypass all this talk about quantum mechanics and gift you with that element of indeterminacy that allows for a free choice to be made. And so I think that when I discovered that, I thought it was mind-blowing, because this is one of the really big problems with free will that people see. And I understand why they have this problem, but I think that resolves the problem. And so what you're left with is we have reasons and we have influences, but those don't cause. So that if the woman ends up going to the business meeting, or if she ends up helping solve the mugging, in both cases, if you ask her, why did you do that? It's not like she's going to say, I don't know, it's just random. She'll have reasons. She'll be able to tell you what her influences were and why she did it. But it wasn't determined. By definition, it wasn't determined because there was indeterminism in the process.
Thank you for that, and thank you for your super chat. So kind of you, writer John Buck. Ethan also says, I basically asked the same question as John Buck, but he won up me with a super chat. Great chat. Thank you for that, Ethan, and for the super chat as well. Really appreciate that. So another objection that I've heard to the argument from free will is kind of relates to like what convinces us of a belief. Like I've heard cosmic skeptics say before, like he's a determinist, and he would say, I see the evidence that people present for like the existence of God or Christianity, and I'm just not convinced of it. And I can't freely choose to be convinced of it. I'm just not convinced. And he used that in part for like a case for determinism. So in that sense, like how do you respond to like that kind of objection to an argument from free will?
So there are two things that come up when we talk about this. What they're describing is what's called direct doxastic volunteerism. And then there's indirect doxastic volunteerism. Direct doxastic volunteerism is if I were to say, okay, I'm just going to choose to believe that behind me right now in my set is a pink elephant. Okay. And I can look around and I don't see one there, but so what? I can just decide to believe it. Okay. Well, obviously I don't think we have that. Okay. I do actually think we can decide to believe it. I just don't think we can deliver to ourselves on that and actually believe it. So I get that. And that's what they're talking about. But there is this other thing, indirect doxastic volunteerism. And what that means is when you think, okay, I see something, there could be some merit to it. So I'm going to put myself in a position where I open myself up intentionally to the possibility of it. And I begin to study the best of what the people that take this particular position have to offer. And I'm not going to just have these walls up. I'm going to really open myself up to it. And in fact, I want to believe it. So I'm going to lean into it. And and because we're good at convincing ourselves of things, you can end up allowing that belief to arise naturally for you. And you chose to do that. You just weren't able to do it directly. You did it through a process. Tim has a great analogy for this too. He says, when I first met my wife, I didn't love, I think this is right. I didn't love her child initially right away. I would like to choose to have those feelings of affection and love toward this person, but I couldn't just do that right away. But what I did was I chose to put myself in positions, like I would go to baseball games with him, or I would go out to eat with him, or play video games with him, or whatever, put myself in positions where that feeling of love would arise naturally. Did I choose to have those feelings? Yes, but I didn't choose to have them immediately and directly. I chose to have them through a process. And I think that's perfectly reasonable.
Another objection that we'll hear is our choices can reduce down to neuroscience. This is kind of gets into like the whole like physicalism debate regarding philosophy of mind, but they'll say, we can just detect our choices through neuroscience, and, our consciousness comes from the brain. So obviously a whole different thing we're talking about here, but like, how would you respond to that kind of objection that like our choices can be reduced down to neuroscience?
So I would recommend a book for people that have that objection by Alfred Mealy. And this book by Alfred Mealy is called Free: How Science Has Not Disproven Free Will. And I don't even know if this guy, I don't know that this guy's a Christian. I have no reason to believe that he is. But he wrote this book, and the point was, these things are all based on things like what are called the Libit experiments. So there's been other experiments, but the Libit experiments are by far the most famous. And if anyone out there has YouTube Premium, there's a show called Mind Field, and in which this guy talks about modern iterations of the Libit experiment. And the way they work is, they put two boxes in front of a person. This is not how Libit did it, but this is the modern variation. Put two boxes in front of someone with buttons on each one and a light above each one, and put electrodes on people's brains. And tell the person, don't think too much about when or which of these two buttons you're going to push. Just push one whenever. Just try even not to think about it. And then just push one. And so they go to push one, and the light above the box of the button they're about to push comes on like a half a second before they push the button. It read their neural electricity and knew the machine knew which button they were going to push before they were even necessarily consciously aware of it. And so people point to experiments like this and say, look, we've already proven that free will doesn't exist. You'll hear these big bombastic claims all the time. We've already proven it doesn't exist because of the Libit experiments and things like them. There's a couple of problems with this. Number one, I don't think the Libit experiments prove what they think they prove, because number one, they're telling the person, don't think about which thing you're going to do. In other words, try not to choose, try to be random. Okay. So don't be surprised if they then are more or less random. And secondly, they are still in some sense making a choice, but it's the difference between picking and choosing. That's the language that's used about this, picking and choosing. So picking is like, which door am I going to walk through of a double door when I go into the gas station? I'm just kind of picking. But where am I going to go for dinner? No, I'm choosing that. I'm thinking hard about that. Okay. So even if you were to demonstrate that a few seconds or a half a second before or something, that we can look at your neural electricity and know what you're going to pick, which is just a flick of your muscle. It's a broad leap to then say, therefore, all of your choices are determined in that same way. Actually, what people like me say is, it may well be that much of the time when we're just picking, we are running on something like determinism, but there are moments where we make real decisions, serious decisions, and that is where libertarian freedom would come in. And all of these Libit experiments have these, and experiments like them have these same problems. And so I think that takes care of that.
Mhm. JMD Apologetics says, how does Braxton answer the luck objection to libertarian free will, which applies to a strong principle of sufficient reason to libertarian free will? I've heard atheists like Oppie that would say that like libertarian freedom would undermine like whatever begins to exist have a cause. So kind of similar to that. But like, what's your thoughts, Braxton?
Yeah, so we're not talking about persons when we're talking about those causal relations, like with the Kalam cosmological argument. We're talking about the existence of physical things, not concepts like that. So I don't think it does cause a problem for it. And I've even heard William Lane Craig say as much. Interestingly, with the Kalam, I actually think the Kalam establishes libertarian freedom. And sometimes I use it if someone thinks there's value in the Kalam, it helps with premise 2 of my free will argument, because here's the thing. If we go through the whole Kalam and through the conceptual analysis that comes after the Kalam to get to the point where we have, okay, the cause of the physical universe is a spaceless, timeless, non-material, sufficiently powerful, exceedingly wise mind. One of the reasons we know that it's a mind is because whatever stands as the cause of the physical universe would have to be, if it's spaceless and timeless and non-material, it would have to have libertarian freedom for the following reason. There wasn't anything else and no time for anything else to happen to lead to a cause deterministically. And there was nothing happening and no time for it to happen within for us to have randomness. And so you would just have to have a libertarian choice. And so I think that the Kalam gives you libertarianism, to the point that even with Calvinist Christians like Chris Date, who are determinists and will tell you they're determinists, Chris Date on our show was willing to say, no, I don't think libertarian freedom is off the table for God because of that very reasoning. So if someone wants to object to libertarian freedom because they just think it's not a thing in concept, well, if you think the Kalam is successful, if you're a Christian or a theist and think the Kalam is successful, you already, I think, must believe in libertarian freedom, because that first cause would have to have it. Then the question only becomes, do we have it or not? And so looping back around to the question, I don't think it's a problem, because we're not talking about things like choices. We're talking about the coming into existence of beings and entities and things.
We'll have one more question here as we're starting to run out of time, and then we'll start to head our way out. Jose Martinez says, kind of a good way to kind of wrap this up is, he says, if an atheist affirms free will, isn't that inconsistent with naturalism? I could hear a skeptic saying, okay, Braxton, maybe there are some good arguments for free will, but I don't think it gets you to God. So what would you think of an atheist affirming free will and its consistency with naturalism?
I know why he says that, and I used to say that, and I think it would be really, really weird. It would sit really, really weird on their worldview. But they could say here's the only way out for them is that I know of, that I can imagine. Let me put it that way. I mean, they could just play naturalism with gaps and say, maybe we have free will and we just don't know how, but later on down the line, science and the lab coat priesthood will deliver it to us. But the only way I know that they have out of that is to say our brains are quantum machines, quantum computers, and they inject that indeterminacy. But there again, I think they're in a real tough spot, because that would mean the greatest design for human brains to be able to make libertarian choices like ever. And so, and another good reason that I didn't mention earlier for why God makes the best sense of our having libertarian freedom, if you grant that we have it, is that libertarian freedom gives you several things. I tried to write down what all do we get if libertarian freedom is true? Well, we get the ability to make rational affirmations. We've said that. We get a robust, meaningful morality. We've said that. We get love. I think the highest understanding of love comes with free will. And we get pure altruism. It's the only way you get things that are legitimately and really done purely selflessly. Most things, even like a woman pushing her child out from being hit by a car, I think that might be really purely selfless. But someone could say, well, in some sense, she wanted to be a good mother, or think of herself as a good mother, or something like that. But I think if libertarian freedom is true, you could have pure altruism, pure selflessness, because you're not doing just what you most desire. You could choose against what you most desire, because your desires are influences, but not necessarily causes. And when you look at those four things, rationality, morality, love, and pure selflessness, pure altruism, those are all things that are important for relationships. And the Bible happens to tell us that what God wants most is that we have these relationships and love the Lord your God and love your neighbor as yourself. I think God makes the best sense out of the teleology, the design that seems to be there with our free will. So I think in some, a naturalist could affirm free will, but they would affirm it at their peril, because then they're granting, I think, the greatest design argument conceivable.
Lots of great stuff, Braxton. Thank you so much for your time. Is there any like last thoughts, things you didn't get to say that you want to kind of bring up before we wrap things up here?
I don't think so. I just say that I really appreciate channels like yours, and I'm glad that we've got young apologists out there doing this, as I will in a few days turn 40 and no longer will be a younger person. And so
you didn't have to out yourself there.
Yeah, I know, but the gray in my beard will get there eventually. But anyway, no. And I would encourage people, if you want to, it doesn't cost you much. We work with people on this. If you want to become a student at Trinity College of the Bible and Theological Seminary, we have a program for apologetic. We have several apologetics programs at each degree level, and you can learn from professors like me and Jonathan Pritchett and Tim Stratton and Chris Date and Leighton Flowers and Steve Gregg. And why wouldn't you want to do something? Chris Featherstone, why wouldn't you want to do that? So I hope you will. And you can do that by going to trinitysem.edu. And if you don't do anything else, subscribe to this channel and then go subscribe to Trinity Radio. All right. So that's what I would say.
Thank you so much, Braxton. I would encourage everyone. We're going to get Trinity Radio to 20,000 subscribers by the end of the day. So I'd encourage you to help us reach that goal so you can go subscribe to Trinity Radio. Thank you so much for tuning in, everyone. Roxby, the programmer, SJ, everyone else who was here, everyone who gave a super chat, Dean and Spartan Theology, and John Buck. Really appreciate that at all. You guys, oh my gosh, I can't talk. You guys as well. Your support means a lot to me. And if you enjoy us, just be sure to subscribe on your way out. Thank you so much for your time, everyone. I hope you have a good day. Thank you for joining me, Braxton, and God bless everyone.